Hey there, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a variety of percussion sounds, both melodic and amelodic, including sounds like these. So as I was getting ready to make this video, I was thinking about how percussion is this really broad kind of catch-all category of musical instruments. You've got everything from obviously a bass drum, snare drum, hi-hats and cymbals, percussion instruments that are amelodic to instruments that are melodic, like the xylophone, marimba, kalimba, glockenspiel, which are all very fun words to say, to bells, the triangle, and even the piano, which is technically a percussion instrument. And the only thing that all of these instruments have in common, for the most part, with some little exceptions, is that the way that they produce sound is in one way or another, you have a thing and then another thing that hits that thing. I mean, it sounds kind of stupid when you put it that way, but at the heart of it, it really is this kind of like primal, primitive action, but as simple as hitting something might seem. The physics of what happens when a percussion instrument gets hit, whether that's a drumstick hitting a batter head of a drum or a hammer hitting the string of a piano, the physics of that are shockingly complex. There's a great series of articles that a guy wrote about the physics of it and then the synthesis of recreating the sounds on the basis of that physics. I'll put a link to those below. Now, I'm not smart enough to understand all of this stuff, let alone explain it, so I'm going to simplify everything a great deal by breaking percussion sounds down into two parts. You have the initial hit, where one thing actually comes into contact with another thing, and that produces this sort of explosion of sound, which is really this sort of burst of vibrations that get released into the air from that initial strike. So that's part one. And then part two is after that strike happens, there are vibrations that go through the thing itself and then often set in motion even more vibrations. For example, in something like a snare drum or a bass drum, you have vibrations on the actual surface that you're hitting, but then those vibrations cause vibrations inside of the drum in the air that's trapped inside of the cavity. And different kinds of instruments have different kinds of vibrations that happen after the initial strike, and sometimes there's different phases to the vibrations, and the way they play out and the way they sound is going to change depending upon how the instrument is constructed and whether it's leather or metal or wood that you're hitting. But in any case, we can generalize here and just say there's two phases: initial hit and then subsequent vibrations. Now, that initial hit is almost instantaneous, and so to capture that suddenness with our amplitude envelope, we are going to leave the attack on the default 0. Another very characteristic thing about percussion sounds is that they come quickly and they go away pretty quickly. They don't linger around for too long compared to other instruments. So for starters here, with our release, we can bring that all the way down to 0, which will now give us this, which is quick but doesn't really sound percussive at all. And it doesn't matter how quickly we press the key, the sound doesn't go away quickly enough. And the other thing here is that the sound is kind of instantly coming and instantly going. If we represented it graphically, we'd have sort of a square shape here with our volume. What we want is something more like this, where we have this kind of gradual decay that's happening over a very short period, but is taking place over time. We have the initial peak in volume that happens almost instantaneously, and then it goes away very quickly. So we can't do that with the release, although there is a trick you can do with the release that I will show you towards the end of the video. But to get that decay, we need to use a trick that I showed in the last video that I made for Sonicware. Put a link to that in the description as well. And that is to sort of create a fake decay and sustain portion position of an envelope by using our LFO, assigning that LFO1 specifically, to the new oscillator level parameter that's become available to us with the latest firmware update. And then we're going to make this a triggered LFO. So I'm going to set this to 1. And then for the shape, we're going to choose a ramping down shape. And so now if we bring up the depth and the rate of our LFO, we get a super short sound. The higher the rate goes, the shorter the sound is going to be. If we bring it back, it's going to be a bit longer. And there is a sort of drop in volume that happens with this. Like that's what it sounds like with the LFO down to 0. If I bring it up, for some reason, just bringing the depth up, even with the rate at 0, drops the volume. So I'm going to compensate for that by bringing our level up here. Now it has a bit more strength. So I'm going to leave it around there for now. Now, this doesn't sound super percussive at the moment, but if we take our waveform and put it on something else like sine wave, now you can hear we're starting to get somewhere. And our reverb is still off. We put a little bit of reverb on this. Well, now we're already starting to get somewhere. Now that's a pretty boring sound in and of itself. However, just with this setup, let's bring the reverb down here a little bit. Just with this setup, if you experiment with some of the different wavetables and waveforms you have available to you, you can actually get some interesting sounds already just with this simple configuration. And that's because with some of these wavetables, especially like the FM ones, the waveforms that we have inside of this table are snapshots of waveforms that you would normally, outside of wavetable synthesis, have to produce on your own through doing synthesis. And if you take those waveforms and you put them inside of this context where you have this super short attack and decay, you can actually get some interesting percussive sounds right out of the box. For example, so these are like vaguely bell-like sounds. Some more so than others. And one that's particularly cool is the triangle/noise table. This one starts off at the 0 position. It's just a plain old triangle wave. However, if you go up to like 20, for example, it's a more noise-like waveform. And something about that, I don't know what, I can't really explain this, I can just hear it, and what I hear is what sounds sort of like a toy piano sound. And with any of these sounds, I would encourage you to always experiment with the rate on your LFO, your fake decay and sustain of your envelope, because the sounds will really change character depending on where you put this. Like if I put it too long, it starts to lose that piano-like quality. Too short, it also loses it, and in between you get some better results. And you might want to also experiment with bringing the release up a bit, especially if you have the rate set to a lower value, so that the sound lingers a little bit after you let go of the keys. Another thing that can be really cool to experiment with here is changing the voice mode to arpeggiator, choosing a pattern for this. The up ones are some of my favorites, so like up +2 for example, and then change the note value to something fast. Let's go all out with 30-second notes. And now if we play the keyboard, get some pretty cool results. And we can do the same thing with our other wavetables. And right now I'm just inside of the drone 1 structure. If we change our structure to, let's say, pad 1, we can also experiment here with taking our pitch parameter and putting that up or down an octave. So that then we have, at any given time, 2 octaves of notes at the same time. And again, experiment with the LFO rate and the release. And remember that within each of these wavetables, you have 128 waveforms. Also remember that the probability parameter does apply to the arpeggiator, so you can bring this down, let's say to 80%, and now there's only an 80% chance of any given note being played when I'm arpeggiating. Some of these sound kind of like a harpsichord, which isn't technically a percussion instrument because with a harpsichord, unlike piano, the string gets mechanically plucked instead of hammered. But I think a harpsichord is similar enough to a piano that we can consider it a sort of weird cousin of a percussion instrument. Anyway, you get the idea. One thing to keep in mind with some of these is that if you go up in the octaves, start to get some A melodic sounds, especially if you go to the red one. And also keep in mind that we haven't even done anything with the filter yet. That can also really change the quality of the sound. Same with the resonance. And you can experiment with doing filter sweeps on this, the second LFO that you still have available to you. And then also remember that with a lot of these structures, like the pad 1 structure that we're in, you have the built-in modulator that's going to allow you to modulate between different parts of the wavetable that you're in. So let's bring the rate up here. Bring the depth down. Let's try a different table. Try changing the arpeggiator here to do random. No, I don't like that. Down. Okay, so if you put the depth and rate of the modulator at high values, it starts to not sound that great. It's a bit too much, but you change the modulator shape from sine wave to something like ramp up or ramp down. Well, now it's getting triggered each note, and you're going straight from one position in the wavetable, the harmonic parameter, to another position. You're sort of morphing between two different waveforms. And you're doing that more or less quickly depending on the rate. And to a greater or lesser extent depending on the depth. And in different directions depending on whether you do ramp up or ramp down. So for example, if we go back over to the triangle wave and we set our initial parameter somewhere up here. So remember, if I bring the modulator off, this is our kind of toy piano at 22. But if we bring it down to 0, we're at just that plain triangle wave. And so now if I put our modulator back on, we're morphing from that piano sound to that triangle sound. And now we have something that doesn't sound like a piano at all. In fact, it's this sort of weird mixture between a drum sound and a non-percussive synth sound. Now, at the moment, we have our rate in the low hundreds. If I bring it down, we're going to hear more of that synth sound, the triangle wave at the end of it. But if I bring it up, we're going to hear less of it, and the initial percussive sound is going to sound more prominent in contrast. And if we bring down our release, now we start to lose the sound completely. But we can bring it further down to further emphasize the percussive sound. Another thing you can experiment with is the shimmer. So I have the shimmer at 0, but if you bring it up, get some weird percussive sounds in the background as well. Don't know if I like it particularly with this particular sound, but if we change the wavetable here, you can get some pretty cool things going on. I realized I stopped narrating at a certain point there, but all I was doing was just experimenting with the modulator's rate and depth, and then the rate on our LFO1, our fake envelope, and the different wavetables and starting positions within the harmonic wavetable parameter. I think I'm kind of sick of the shimmer sounds. I'm going to bring that down. I do still have the reverb on. The reverb makes a big difference in a lot of these percussive sounds. If you bring it off, it starts to be a lot more flat. You really need to lean on the reverberations to get a percussive sound on the Ambient Zero I found. And by the way, speaking of reverb, I only have this small one on right now. If you put it on a larger one, the tail is just way too long for nice short percussive sounds, so I would just leave it on the small. Now I'm wondering what would happen if we switch this to 16th notes. So as you can see here, I'm kind of purposefully dragging this out just to show you that, like, just mess around with exploring different wavetables and waveforms and different positions that you can put the depth and rate in, and the rate of your modulator and the rate of your fake LFO and your release time. Just mess around with it, and you're going to stumble across a variety of percussive sounds. Like with this last one, where I was in this wavetable and I initially had the harmonic position up here. I mean, it's vaguely bell sounding, but it doesn't sound that percussive. But as I brought this harmonic parameter down and put my starting position in one of these lower down waveforms, start to get some more percussive sounds. And I'm really just stumbling upon these, and I would encourage you to do the same. Okay, so those are some basic ways of coming up with some percussive sounds, relying very heavily on the fact that this is a wavetable synthesizer, and so we're already given some sounds that can lend themselves towards percussive sounds as long as we create a very short decay with our fake envelope produced by our LFO1. But if you want to get into more complex territory and come up with some even more interesting sounds, then what you really want to do here is switch over to one of the Atmos structures. So either Atmos 1, which centers around ring modulation, or Atmos 2, which centers around frequency modulation, FM synthesis. So I'm going to start with Atmosphere 1, and I am going to put our waveform initially just on a sine wave. And then I'm going to do the same thing again with creating a fake envelope. So assigning LFO1 to our oscillator level, making it a triggered envelope, and giving it a ramping down shape, and then bringing up the depth, compensating for the volume loss, and then bringing the rate up, adding some reverb. Okay, now here's where things can start to get interesting. So our modulator in this structure is a ring modulator. If we start bringing the rate up, the depth is already set to a middle position. If we start bringing the rate up, we get these kind of metallic sounding overtones, and those overtones are higher in pitch the higher we put the rate. And the lower the pitch, the lower we put the rate. And then with our depth, we're basically controlling how much of that metallic sound we're getting. If we put it really low, it's going to be pretty subtle. If we put it high, it's going to be not so subtle. And so we can triangulate between these two parameters to get a variety of kind of cool, spooky, metallic sounds. And note that this really works the best with the sine wave as your waveform. If you go to the default sawtooth wave, for example, you get something totally different. Same thing with square wave. Triangle is pretty similar to a sine wave and is going to sound similar, but notice how we have a little bit of extra static in the sound. And some of these can sound kind of cool because, like, that octave, for example, it's reminding me a little bit of like a kettle drum almost. And some of these other ones give this sort of rattly metallic sound. Especially that one too. And different waveforms within different wavetables will give you different sounds. But for now, I'm just going to leave it on the sine wave. Okay, so that's kind of cool, but it's also a little bit one-dimensional. Like, we have this metallic sound, and it's definitely more interesting than just this sine wave. But what would make this sound even more interesting is if we combine the two things together and had one sort of evolve into the other. So for example, imagine if we started with this metallic sound, but then we took our depth and really, really quickly swept it down so that then we ended the sound on the sine wave. And so if I tried to do that manually, it would sound like this. I'm not really fast enough to do it, so I'm going to take LFO2 and assign it to the modulator's depth parameter. And I'm going to make this also a triggered LFO so that it happens every time I press a key. It starts from the beginning of the LFO again, and then I'm going to give it a ramping down shape so that we take the depth wherever it's initially set and then ramp it down super, super quickly. Now, one kind of annoying thing here, I think it's a bug, is that if you reassign the second LFO, it's going to mess up the first LFO a little bit. Notice how the sound just keeps lingering. For some reason, changing the assignment here makes it forget what the LFO1 settings are. So what you have to do is you have to take one of the knobs and just sort of jostle it back and then forward to the value that you want it at. So I just do it with the depth knob because I know I want this to be maxed out at 127. So when I reassign, do this again, I lose the LFO1, and so I just take the depth, wiggle it back, wiggle it forward. Now we're good to go again. Okay, so our LFO2 is not currently doing anything because the depth and rate are set at 0, so let's bring them up. And notice how we don't really hear anything until the rate is really brought all the way up. because we have such a short window to work in here that we don't hear any effect from the LFO unless it's going really, really, really fast. Now that's with our LFO1, our fake envelope, maxed out. If we bring it back a little bit, now we're really starting to hear an initial attack, sort of transient onset sound where we have this ring modulation going on. If I didn't have it at all, it would sound like this. Now we're getting a tiny bit of it at the beginning, but then it disappears rapidly thanks to our second LFO. If I take that away, you can hear we just had that bell-like sound. But because we're taking it away, we start with that ring modulated sound, and then we go to our pure sine wave. And something about the evolution from one thing to the other makes this sound, to me at least, no longer metallic. It sounds more wooden. And maybe a little bit of metallic in there, and we can play around with the filter here. Let's try arpeggiating this again. It's a little too fast. Try 16th note. Pretty nice. Now, take this out of arpeggiator for a moment. Another thing you can experiment with here is the shape of your modulator. This is set to sine wave by default, but if you change it to, let's say, square, get a little bit of a different sound. Same thing with triangle, sawtooth, reverse sawtooth. The differences are subtle. Sometimes you can barely hear them. And then also keep in mind that if you adjust the rate, it's also going to affect the sound. Same thing with depth. So now it sounds like we're back in more metallic, bell-like territory, especially if we bring the filter up. Adjusting the rate on our LFO1 here to make our decay quicker or slower. The more things ring out, the more bell-like they often become, because that's what bells do, they ring. And then the shorter you go on this, the higher the value, the more punchy the sound becomes. And then I start messing around with the depth on the modulator. Same thing with shape again. And I know I'm being a little bit repetitive here, but the point is just experiment with different, what would this be? 1, 2, 3, 4 things. So not triangulating, square-ulating, I don't know what to call it. But yeah, just adjust these different values in relation to each other and just experiment with that, and you're going to get all sorts of different sounds. And we could change this to pentagoninating by changing our wavetable. Hexagoninating by changing our harmonic value. And then you can also do various things by reassigning LFO2 to something other than modulator depth. But if you're going to do that, like, I think modulating this modulator depth is one of the main advantages of the ring modulator structure, Atmos 1. If you want to use LFO2 to do something else, then I think you should switch over to Atmos 2, because this is going to give you some other options to work with. So actually, I'm going to reinitialize everything and switch this to Atmos 2. And then once again, I'm going to put this on a sine sine wave. I would recommend usually starting with a sine wave as your base, put some sound design stuff in place, get it to somewhere you like, and then start experimenting with the other wavetables, but start with sine wave as your default. Okay, so I'm gonna do our fake decay envelope again, assigning to oscillator level, trigger to 1, shape to negative, increase our volume level to compensate for the volume loss, bring up our depth, bring up the rate of our fake decay, put in some reverb. Okay, we're back in business now. Okay, so with our Atmos 2 structure, remember that we have this balance parameter, which is really basically how much frequency modulation do we have going on. This is set to a very low level of 10 by default. If we bring it up, well, now we've got the maximum amount. And if we come over to the pitch parameter, well, I'm not going to explain FM synthesis in this video. I already did that in another video. I'll put a link to that below. But you can think of this pitch parameter as basically controlling the pitch. And if you start at the lowest level of 0.5 and you start multiplying by 2, so from 0.5 to 1 to 2 to 4, and so on and so forth, your pitch is going to go up in octaves. And if you go to in between levels, you start to get some weirder overtones, which can be very useful for percussion sounds. Now, our modulator in the Atmos 2 structure is connected to our pitch parameter. So if we bring up the rate and the depth, start to get some really kind of not super pleasant squiggly sounds, but just like with Atmos 1, we can come down to our modulator shape, change that from the default sine wave to our old friend ramp down. And now we're just taking the pitch and basically sweeping it down. And we can do that more or less quickly, depending on where we set our modulator rate. And then your pitch is going to set your starting position basically with the pitch sweep. So around here, you really get this sort of like knocking sound. And when the rate's super high up on the modulator, you can barely hear the pitch sweep as a pitch sweep. Like you can't hear that the pitch is going down, you just sort of hear the effect of it going down really rapidly. But if you bring the rate down, you can actually start to hear it. This brings us into tom drum territory. And when you're going for a drum, the speed of your decay, controlled by LFO1's rate, is really going to have a big impact on the drum sound, or whether it even sounds like a drum. Because if you make the decay too long, you start getting away from drum territory. If you make it super short, you're not going to really hear much of the pitch sweep. Which could be what you want. It just depends on what kind of drum sound you want. So really simplifying and generalizing here. For a snare sound, you're going to want a really short decay. It's not really a snare yet. There's some other things we have to do to it, but just to focus on this aspect of it for a moment, just the decay speed, you want that fast. And then as you make it slower, by bringing the rate back on our fake decay, start to get into tom drum and bass drum territory. For tom drums, you're going to want to bring the pitch up a bit. Maybe not that high. And then remember that your pitch parameter here is also controlling the starting pitch. You just have to triangulate or quadrangulate or whatever word we want to use here to get what you want. For a bass drum or kick, I'd start off lower. And actually bring our starting pitch down here too. There's a lot to play around with here. Now let's go back to a snare sound. So I'm going to bring our octave back up. make this nice and short. Now, another option that we have in this Atmos 2 structure is the secondary parameter of this knob, the one that says detuning, but in this structure, it actually controls the feedback, which I know I said I wouldn't explain FM synthesis, but just to make this a little comprehensible to those who don't know, with FM synthesis, we have one oscillator that's oscillating another oscillator, making it oscillate faster or slower, which results in overtones that go higher or lower in pitch. Again, simplifying here a great deal. And with a feedback parameter, what we're doing is we're taking the oscillations of the oscillator, the first one, and then feeding it back into itself, oscillating it with its own oscillations, thereby creating a feedback loop, which makes the resulting sound waves more and more complex, which at some point basically results in noise. And when you have a really short burst of noise, the result sounds very percussive. If you bring it all the way up, you're getting into sort of like cymbal or hi-hat territory, especially if you bring the octave up. And you bring it down a little bit and tone it back a little by decreasing the feedback amount. And then maybe let's make our pitch sweep a bit faster here. By calibrating these parameters in relation to each other, you can get a variety of drum sounds as well. Same thing with our starting pitch. So yeah, here I have the rate set pretty high, the starting pitch all the way up. And now we're really starting to get into kind of hi-hat territory. And we still have sort of a low down pitch that we're getting at the end of that sound. So this might be a place to experiment with a different filter, a bandpass filter. And then we can focus on different parts of the overall spectrum of the sound. But this was all a digression. I wanted to show a snare sound. So let's go back and bring down the pitch. Okay, one last option I want to show you with this Atmos 2 structure, which is going to take everything to another level of complexity, is we still haven't done anything with our LFO 2 yet. And remember what we did with Atmos 1 with our ring modulation, where we set it up in such a way that we had some ring modulation going on initially, and then with the second half of the sound, we got rid of it gradually, all happening within a very short space of time, so that although we had this really quick sound, there was this evolution that happened during it. And we can do a similar thing with Atmos 2 by taking our balance parameter, or what would normally be our balance parameter, the secondary parameter of this knob, which, remember, with this structure is actually controlling the amount of frequency modulation that we have going on. We have this maxed out at the moment. But if we bring it down, we're back to that initial sine wave. We don't have any frequency modulation going on at all now. And so we can use LFO2 to really quickly sweep from this maximum value to this minimum value, and thereby have some evolution with our sound. So do a similar thing to what we've been doing this whole time, only this time we're going to assign LFO2 to our balance. Now remember, the moment we do this, the moment we reassign LFO2, it's going to ruin our first LFO. So we got to wiggle one of the knobs to bring it back the way it should be. Okay, there we go. And now we're going to turn LFO2 into a triggered ramp down LFO and bring up the depth and the rate. And there we go. So now we have this initial onset to our sound, this very transient bit of frequency modulation, which then gives way to our sine wave gradually. And right now we have the rate of LFO1, our fake decay, set at a mid value. If we bring it up, we're going to emphasize the onset of the sound more, the attack. And then the more we bring it down, the slower we make the decay, the more we hear the second half. And we have a lot of control over the way that the onset, the first portion of our sound, sounds by going back to all those parameters we looked at earlier. So, for example, we can make our initial pitch sweep faster or slower. We can set the initial pitch higher or lower. And we can have more or less feedback. No feedback. A little bit of feedback. can hear that sort of squiggly sound. That's our pitch sweep. If we get rid of it, it sounds like that. If we bring it back but have it slow, it sounds like this. Make it faster. And then adjust our initial pitch in relation to whatever we put this at. The higher we go, the more kind of high-pitched squeaking we get. If we don't like that, we can bring down the pitch. Increase or decrease that feedback. Arpeggiate this thing. It's a bit too fast when it's one note after another, but I wonder how it would sound if we brought down the probability, say 50%. Keep in mind that the release is going to affect your arpeggiated sound. If you bring it really down, it's going to give you shorter sounds than you can produce if you just press the keys manually in one of the other voice modes. And then our decay is also going to really affect our sound. So yeah, that's just looking at the wide range of sounds you can produce just by manipulating all the parameters we've looked at with our LFOs, modulator, pitch, feedback, and so on. And that's all just with our underlying sine wave. If we change this wave form to something else, we hear all sorts of different flavors of the sound, keeping all those parameters constant. Of course, we could come back and change those as well. But while I'm on this random, I wanted to point out that this is a really cool one to explore because all the waveforms are really different from one waveform to another. And so you can just change the harmonic position and explore a really wide variety of sounds by just moving that one knob a little bit. And then once you get something you like, you can try messing around with the other parameters. So I had no idea what I was doing there. I was just messing around with knobs, freely exploring them, and I would really recommend doing the same. All right, now I'm gonna bring this back to just polyphonic mode, put back our waveform to a sine wave, get back to something that could serve as the basis of a bass drum, especially if we make the decay longer, or it could be some sort of snare drum if we made it higher. Now, some odds and ends I want to show you are some other options with the LFOs. So, for example, instead of routing this to our balance, we could, well, there's a few things. We could take the tuning parameter and do a ramping down triggered LFO on that, which we already have set up. And remember, that's going to mess up our first LFO. Let's fix that. Okay, so now we have even more pitch sweeping action going on. It just sounds like that without it. And now we have that. Change our initial pitch, the pitch sweep that's occurring thanks to our frequency modulation. So we have really two pitch sweeping actions going on at the same time. So you can get some more sounds that way as well. You can also route the second LFO, I want to fix the first one real quick, to the filter. And if you bring the filter low, for example, and then ramp it up, or do a sine wave, yeah, that's the one I want. You can get some kind of bubbly sounds. The last thing I want to show you is sort of a little bonus here is I'm going to go back to our oscillator level and I'm just going to turn this off. Then LFO2, I'm going to route that to our balance. So we had this initial kind of percussive sound now, but because I've turned off the LFO1, our fake decay envelope, remember what I said at the beginning, no matter how quickly I play the keys, it's going to ring out a bit too long. However, what we've already seen with the arpeggiator, that if the note length is something short, each note is only going to get played for a very short period of time. And the same thing happens with our sequencer, which shares the same note values. And the same thing happens with our sequencer, which shares the same note value. So if I put, for example, a note in 1, 5, 9, and 13, well, when I enter the note in this recording mode, we hear it for as long as I press down the note. Like that. Get rid of that note. But when we play the sequence, if we bring our release down, we start to get back into percussive territory. And so this way, without even using that oscillator level LFO trick, we can get some percussion going. For example, we could erase these guys and then let's put in a low note for 1 and 9, and then go up a little bit in our octaves and put a higher note in for 5 and 13. And play that. And let's actually bring down our note value, and then let's bring our probability back up. Okay, here we go. Okay, not a super interesting sound, but it is percussive, and I'm being able to accomplish it just with our release without even doing our decay trick. And if I then, let's just copy this whole layer. So function copy, I'm gonna paste it into our pad there, and I'm gonna clear all the notes. And then I'm gonna make this very staticky by bringing up our feedback. And then I'm going to put one of those in each one of these steps at a fairly high pitch. Now this layer is going to sound like this. Maybe a little too fast. Let's do 16th notes. Bring down the release and then combine that with our other track, and we now sound like this. And actually on this hi-hat sort of layer, let's change the filter to a bandpass. Yeah, that's more like it. So we're getting somewhere, again, without using our oscillator level trick at all. And because we're not using that trick, we can now use this LFO for other things. Like we could just do some pitch sweeping, for example. Or we could do the oscillator trick. And make our drums a little bit punchier. And so we have our sort of kick drum on 1 and 9. And since we want that to be a little bit longer than our snare sound, we can bring down the decay on those steps using parameter recording, and then bring it up on our snare steps, like that. Maybe even more. I wonder if maybe I made our bass drum a little too low. Let's try transposing this up. Adjust the decay a bit. Not the most interesting drum sound. I wonder what would happen if we just randomized this. Another thing we can do here to give this more punch is, that's kind of cool, what if we change the randomization step? Nice. And another thing we can do here to punch things up is use some effects, like drive, for example. Or Bit Crusher. Tilt filter, chorus. You can also give sounds more oomph by changing the voice mode. I had this on arpeggiator by accident. Let's try polyphonic. Oh yeah, that's better. But we could also try unison, which, remember, fires each individual note with 4 voices of that note. So yeah, that's much more powerful. Let's try that with drive. Or delay. Reverse delay. Let's try a different waveform here. Let's run with our pitch sweep. Even try a different shape here for our pitch modulation. Add some feedback. Maybe a little too crazy. So yeah, a lot to mess around there between sequencing and using effects on top of them, and then doing some good old knob fiddling while the sequence gets played. And you can really do a lot with this. So for example, I created this little song where I'm using just a sine wave and Atmos 2 to create a sound like that, much like a lot of the sounds we've seen in this video so far. But I've sequenced them with parameter changes such that this layer here, for example, sounds like this. So it's the same underlying sound on each step, but then some of the parameters get changed. For example, on 5, there's a bit of feedback, and then I copied and pasted this layer into the other 2 layers, and then did some more changing of parameters on different steps, and also played different notes into the sequence to get something that sounds like this on layer 2, and this on layer 1. Put the 3 layers together and it sounds like this. And over on my Instagram channel, my sort of alter ego account, Weird Frog Music, link in description. I'm going to put a full performance of this song up on there, together with this very strange melodic sound I have on the noise layer, which is actually just a sample of me humming. But then I did various things with the parameters to make it sound spookier. Anyway, so point being, there's a lot you can do with the sequencing. I think that would be maybe a whole video onto itself. Anyway, let me know if you'd be interested in me doing a video on that down in the comments. If enough people say yes, I'll try to do it eventually. It takes me a while to record videos these days. But hey, I said I'd do this one, and now I've done it. There's a whole lot more you can go into with synthesizing percussion sounds. This is really just touching the surface, but I hope that gives you enough to get started with. Anyway, thanks for watching, have a great day, and goodbye for now.